People are entering the room now. For those who have just entered, please let me explain. We will be starting the webinar in just about a minute or two. People are entering the room now. Hello, my name is Deborah Dwork, and I am the director of the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second of a year-long virtual series on the subject of refugees and forcibly displaced persons. Offered in the midst of a global refugee crisis, our series examines historical and contemporary cases, laying bare underlying patterns, illuminating unknown aspects, and suggesting paths forward. I thank our partner institution, NYU's Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and most particularly my colleague, Professor Marion Kaplan, who serves as my partner in this initiative. Thanks too to Center Associate Juan Acevedo for his excellent work, John Chinisi and the GC's terrific IT department for his and its constant help, and the entire Center Advisory Board for its warm support. Above all, I am grateful to our speakers today and to our listeners, everyone who has tuned in. Thank you for your interest in this subject. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Eli Karetny, Deputy Director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies and lecturer in political science at Baruch College, CUNY. Eli will have the honor of introducing our esteemed guests. The son of immigrants, not by their own reckoning refugees from Ukraine as it was then, Eli returned to his parents' homeland as a Peace Corps volunteer. His life path took him to scholarship on the intellectual foundations of American neoconservatism, the wartime origins of the United Nations, and now a research project on the Negev Bedouin. In the course of the discussion today, you may catch a glimpse of a core interest, how the Arab concept of sumud, or steadfast survival on ancestral lands presents differently in various Bedouin villages. How relations with neighboring Jewish towns can influence the expression of Samud, and how that can affect the path to recognition for Bedouin villages that remained unrecognized by the state of Israel. I will leave it there. Eli, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Dwork. It is my honor and privilege on behalf of the CUNY Graduate Center, Ralph Bunche Institute, and the Center for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity to introduce our esteemed panel for a discussion of the Bedouin of the Negev. Joining us to discuss this important topic is a distinguished panel of scholars and activists. I will introduce each panelist, then ask each to elaborate on a key issue in 2 rounds of questions, and then we'll take a few questions from the audience. Dr. Thabet Abu Rass is the co-director of the Abraham Initiatives, which aims at full and equal citizenship for Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens. Thabet has authored many publications and media articles on Arab-Jewish relations. He was the director of Adalah's Negev office and of Shatil's office in Beersheba. Thabet got his PhD from the University of Arizona and has taught courses at Ben Gurion University and Sapir College on ethnic relations, land planning, and regional development. Netta Amar-Schiff is a Yemenite Jewish Israeli human rights lawyer who focuses on planning rights and forcible displacement. She's a doctoral candidate at Ben Gurion University, doing research on the forcible displacement of the Bedouin in the Negev and the West Bank. Netta worked with the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and was a board member of B'Tselem and the Voice of Women. Notably, Netta wrote and filed the Mizrahi petition against Israel's controversial 2019 nation-state law. Dr. Murad El-Sana is a research scholar, author, and lecturer at American University. Dr. El-Sana holds a doctorate from the Washington College of Law, where his research focused on Bedouin indigenous land rights. Dr. El-Sana served as director of Adalah's Negev office, where he worked on many cases involving Bedouin evictions and home demolitions. Dr. El-Sana is the author of Indigenous Land Rights in Israel, a comparative study of the Bedouin, which was published by Routledge in 2021. And Dr. Yeela Raana, who teaches in the Department of Public Policy at Sapir Academic College. She's a lifelong advocate for the rights of the Bedouin minority in the Negev and has worked for many years with Bedouin grassroots organizations like the Regional Council for the Unrecognized Bedouin Villages. The format of today's talk is a Q&A about the Negev Bedouin that will focus on the theme of forcible displacement while addressing complex and contentious political dynamics in Israel and the region. A note to the audience, the final round of questions will come directly from you, so please use the Q&A box in Zoom to ask questions of our panelists. To frame the discussion, I want to highlight 3 levels of analysis that I believe are useful in thinking about this important topic. At one level, we have the quintessential example of a modern state imposing sovereign authority over indigenous people and denying them self-determination. Israel's treatment of the Bedouin picks up where the British left off and is consistent with what the Ottomans began. The logic of modern state rule entails security, surveillance, taxation, control of land, resources, development plans. For the Bedouin, modernization has meant sedentarization, urbanization, dispossession, and displacement. Not until the late 19th century did the Ottomans impose land registration requirements on the Bedouin. Weak and fearing the British presence in Egypt, Ottoman security concerns led them to deepen their foothold in the Negev by developing the Beersheba region administratively and encouraging the Bedouin to settle in and around the city. Urbanization begins, but Ottoman weakness allowed the Bedouin to maintain much autonomy. The British, on the other hand, exercised transitional authority under the mandate system, which meant their rule was indirect and impermanent. They did not continue Ottoman land registration requirements and cynically worked with and through Bedouin sheikhs and tribal courts. Even as the British granted the Bedouin a degree of autonomy, they facilitated Jewish land purchases and Jewish settlement in the Negev in opposition to Bedouin resistance. The new Israeli state would declare in the 1950s that all Negev lands belonged to the state. Relying on Ottoman land registration codes, the state ruled that the Bedouin had neither registered nor cultivated the lands they claim. Ancestral Bedouin land by law became state land. So the power of the modern state is level one. At a second level, we have a state with a distinct ideology shaping its identity and social policy. Zionism meant that Israel was not just a modern state, it was a Jewish state. And the Negev has always played a crucial role in the Zionist imagination as Israel's frontier. The Negev becomes not only state land, but also Jewish land. But if Ben-Gurion's project to make the desert bloom is a project by and for Jews, where does that leave the Bedouin? How did the Bedouin fit into the broader Arab-Israeli struggle? How did the Negev Bedouin, who are both indigenous Arabs and also Israeli citizens, think about their collective and individual rights when Palestinian statehood is not their primary goal? The Bedouin have long struggled to have the state recognize their villages and provide the basic services due to all Israeli citizens. But these efforts are stifled by state policies promoting Jewish settlement, policies rooted in a legal theory that treats the Bedouin as intruders, squatters on their own ancestral lands, subject to evictions, home demolitions, forcible displacement. So Zionism provides a second frame. At the final level of analysis, we look at how the Bedouin respond to Israeli policies. What makes their resistance unique and notable? What drives the Bedouin to remain on their ancestral lands? After being displaced en masse in the 1948 war and concentrated in a designated area, a large part of the Bedouin community was pressured to move into state-built towns in the 1970s and 80s, which are now the poorest urban localities in Israel. The many who refused to move still remain in what are about 40 unrecognized villages spread throughout the Negev. That's over 100,000 people in these villages on no official map, no water, electricity, schools, paved roads, public transportation, or health services. Evictions and demolitions continue to make room for new Jewish towns on Bedouin lands. How did the Bedouin resist legally, politically? What are the aims of that resistance? But there are signs of hope. A new series of state resolutions committing big budgets to improving social services in the Bedouin communities. Some villages have been recognized. Others have been assured by the new coalition government that recognition is forthcoming. So Bedouin resistance serves as a third frame. With those three levels of analysis framing our discussion, we now turn to our panelists. Thabet, my first question is for you. Before we look at 1948 and wartime displacement, can you please tell us a little bit about Bedouin life in Ottoman times and then under the British? And specifically, how did modernity begin to change Bedouin life even before Israeli statehood?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, everybody. The Arab Bedouin citizens of Israel are members of indigenous Palestinian Arab minority, a community who remained in their land following the Nakba. They remained in the Nakab, in the Negev area. Prior to the establishment of the State of Israel, around 100,000 Bedouins lived in the Negev. After the establishment, if you can show the map, please. After the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, only 11,000 out of 100,000 people remained. Yes, remained after a massive expulsion of the Bedouins from their land to make room for Jewish newcomers. A process of concentration, as you can see in the map, a process of concentration and urbanization in the Siyaj areas, very limited area within the Negev, very small portion of the Negev. Actually, the government of Israel pushed the remaining Bedouins to this area. Today, the 11,000 Bedouins became 280,000 Arab Bedouins, which make up 1/3 of the population of that area today. They have lived in their ancestral lands for generations, practicing traditional agricultural lifestyle. Well, from the first day of the existence of Israel, the Bedouins were considered as a demographic and geopolitical threat by the government of Israel. The Arab Bedouins, many of whom are living in villages that pre-exist the establishment of Israel, are referred by the Israeli government as squatters and illegal trespassers who are stealing state land. Well, the Israeli policy of displacement, dispossession, concentration, and forced urbanization violates the rights of the indigenous Bedouins and completely disregards their historic ties to the land of the Negev. Now, the Israeli government policy is grounded in widespread myths and misconceptions and stereotypes. I will leave the issue of indigeneity for probably my colleagues, for Dr. Murad, but I would like to just to tackle with one myth that the Arab Bedouins are nomads. Well, the Arab Bedouins have organized in settlements in the Negev since the 16th century under the Ottomans. Their settlements were largely fixed and stabilized by 19th century, while their pastoral way of living necessitated seasonal movement. Yes, there is seasonal movement for 2 and 3 months, and still there for some Bedouins. Their travel centers around historic villages with privately owned plots of land and collectively held pasture of land. These ancestral actually settlements and historic villages are now unrecognized, still unrecognized within the state of Israel after 73 years of the proclamation of the state. The center of Palestinian Bedouins' life has been the city of Bir Saba, the modern city of Bir Saba. Now let us consider the geographical aspect of the region. If they are considering the Bedouins really as nomads, where the Bedouins can wander with their livestock and their sheep. To the east, 30 to 40 miles from Beersheba, the ancient city of Hebron and its surrounding ancient Palestinian city in Hebron Hills. 30 miles to the west, from Beersheba, the city actually of Gaza, which located, Gaza is 1,000 years, over 1,000 years old. If you look to the north, 60 to 80 miles from Beersheba, you will find the cities of Jaffa, Lod, Ramle, and Jerusalem. Even to the south, if you look to the south, the first borderline in the Middle East, the Egyptian-Palestinian border, was established in 1906 by the Ottomans and the British actually. So we cannot really consider the Bedouins as of the Negev as nomads, the way we look to the Tawarik in Sahara Africa, or like the nomads of Saudi Arabia, or even Jordan and Syria, or Iraq, or Iran even. So we are talking about the Holy Land. We are talking about the Holy Land, which has been settled for many centuries. The Ottoman Empire was here a century ago, only 100 years ago, almost. And the British were here between the last century, okay, between 1917 to 1948. Both empires recognized the right of the Bedouins in their land. Both empires recognized actually the customary law that conducted by the Bedouins, used by the Bedouins. So they actually didn't interfere in the life of the traditional life of the Bedouins. Actually, if we look back to the modern city of Beersheba, which was built in 1900, it was built after a purchase of 200 dunams, okay? It's a lot of land from El Azazme tribe, and there are a lot of documentation about this occasion, okay? So we cannot really consider that the Bedouins are invisible people, the way that Israel is doing that right now, or they're not attached to their land, as when probably I'll talk about that in the next round. But it's about time. I would like to conclude and say that the the Bedouins are a part of the landscape of the Negev. It's about time to recognize their land claims and the rights of the land. It's about time to recognize all the unrecognized villages. And I don't want to go to further to explain why they have to recognize, but actually we are talking about indigenous people, okay, that inhabited the Negev since the 7th century and were the only inhabitants of the Negev until the mid 20th century.
Thank you, Thabet. Netta, shifting from the historical to the legal dimension, as Thabet said, the Negev Bedouin have lived on ancestral lands for generations, yet Israeli law treats them as intruders, trespassers, squatters. Negev land has been designated mawat, or uncultivated wasteland, which by legislation made the Negev into state land. Can you please discuss the legal complexities that results in a continuous threat to the Bedouin of forcible displacement under both international law and domestic law? Netta? Netta, are you with us? There, a lost connection, Netta? Maybe we'll come back to Netta. Morad, can we turn to you?
Yes, sure.
We'll come back to this question about forcible displacement, but let's turn to something that Thabet mentioned, indigenous rights. I want to ask how indigenous rights changes the legal landscape. You've written about how Israeli state law is unable to recognize indigenous rights without a transition to legal pluralism. You've discussed how there was a shift from the old colonial law to modern state law, which you call legal monism. And then there was a and then there's a kind of needed transition towards what you call legal pluralism. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Yes, sure. First of all, I would like to comment in the legal situation for the Bedouin land rights. We should not look at the issue only from a legal perspective, although the legal issue is very important here. The issue is more like a political one that sits in the frame of settler colonial states. And this frame defined many of the issues, including the legal issues in Israel. What brings me to legal pluralism is the fact that we in the Negev have been trying for years to litigate in order to bring the state of Israel to recognize the Bedouin land rights. This litigation did not start from yesterday. Actually, the litigation started immediately after the state evicted the Palestinians in 1948 and then started to evict many of the Bedouin from their traditional lands or villages, or what we call dira, okay? Dira is a concept in Arabic that equivalent to a village from the Bedouin traditional living way. And I can tell here in the short time given to me that my family, which is part of a tribe that was evicted not only in 1948, the eviction continued for the Palestinians until 1952. I mean the collective eviction, okay, and the displacement. The individual one continued, and it is taking place until this day, okay? So the collective eviction continued until 1952, okay? My family, for example, was evicted in 1950, and the Jordanians refused to accept Palestinians because of the decisions of the United Nations during that time that called for Israel to stop the eviction of the Palestinians from their historical lands. So my family stayed in the border for about 6 months, and then instead of letting them go back to their own traditional land, they were forced to go back to a different land in order to confiscate their land, okay? So that's what happens with the indigenous people in a project called Titler Colonial Projects, where the colonial states want not only to take their lands, or it exactly want to take their lands, and in order to take their lands, it has to evict them and even to eradicate them, okay, to push them out in order to make a space for the newcomers, for the new state. The eviction and the displacement is not only for the physical people, but also for the legal system. Our legal system, the customary Bedouin legal system that control many issues for the Bedouins, including their land rights, was also evicted, was displaced, was eradicated. The fact that the state is not recognizing this legal system also causes to the state not to recognize our historical lands, and that's what's going on. So whenever we go to the court in Israel, we start to deal with these land rights based on the colonial law, based on the colonial legal system. This legal system was built from the beginning in order to not recognize your land. It's not only not recognize it, but also to dispossess this land, to take it from you in order to make space for the new legal system to come in. And that's what's happening in Israel. So as long as we are dealing with the Bedouin land rights through the colonial legal system, we will not get to anywhere. I'm not saying this as an empty statement, but in fact, we can see that for 70 years, we have been litigating Bedouin land rights through the Israeli legal system with zero success. And I mean it, zero success. More than 1,500,000 dunams, 322 Bedouin land claims, about 200 of them were litigated in courts in Israel. None of these claims was successful in the Israeli courts. And this is show you how the system is built in this way, not to recognize your land, because the moment the legal system starts to recognize your land, that will destroy all the colonial projects in Israel, okay? And that's why I'm trying to crack the system, I'm trying to go to a new legal principles, new legal systems, and to imitate or to learn from other indigenous communities around the world in Latin America, in Australia, and in Canada, and call to the state of Israel to recognize, first of all, the Bedouin legal system, the Bedouin customary law, as additional legal system in the state, especially under the rubric, under the theory of legal pluralism, because Israel is one of the rare states around the world that has legal pluralism. And this legal pluralism is developed more than other states with its own limitations, of course, as I show in my article. In Israel, we have the state legal system, we have the rabbinical legal system, and we have the Sharia legal system and other legal systems that continue to apply. What we are saying today is Israel can theoretically recognize and add another legal system to these many legal systems based on the theory of legal pluralism. Adopting another legal system will start to understand, to see, and to recognize some of the Bedouin land rights, but not also in land rights. In other fields like the tribal legal system that was taken place and continue to practice until this day in Israel would be helpful to provide some not only rights, but a new order in the community. The phenomena of violence that we continue to see among the Palestinians inside Israel, and especially among the Bedouins, also can be seen as part of this elimination of their customary law and their traditional legal system, okay? So do I have?
No, that's great, Murad. I do have a follow-up question, but I'm going to hold off until the second round because I want to press you a little bit about whether there's a difference or even an important difference between the old colonial framework and the modern state legal monism, what you call that. There are some differences there. But maybe let's hold off on that until the second round. I want to come back to Netta, who had some technical problems, but now is back with us. Just to invite you to talk about the continuous threat to the Bedouin of forcible displacement under both international law and domestic law. Please.
Okay. So first of all, I'm sorry for it was a network failure. I want to thank you, Eli, and thank you all for the invitation and for the floor to share my research and my thoughts. We've heard about the applicability of the international indigenous rights framework. And so in 2011, Bedouin groups from both the Negev and the West Bank approached the UN Permanent Forum for the Rights of Indigenous People, asking for protection. So building on Kedar, Iftahel, Amaraz, and Dr. Murad's analysis and the call for application of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People from 2007 to the Negev Bedouins, the question I would like to pose concerns the influence of international law, of course, as it is applied domestically, and we've heard a bit about this now, on Bedouin space from a broader perspective than land rights. And the question is to what extent international law, including UNDRIP, facilitates directly or indirectly the permanent situation of Bedouin displaceability under Israeli rule. And just a few words about what is displaceability. So as proposed by Tzfadia in Iftahel, displaceability differs from forcible displacement, as it is a permanent structural manifestation of hierarchical and oppressive power relations in settler colonial and neoliberal societies. Furthermore, displaceability encompasses a spectrum of actions and inactions, including what is considered in relation to West Bank Bedouins' coercive environment in international humanitarian law. Its elusive nature can be observed from like a bird's eye, and that is exactly what's been done in Emptied Lands book, whereby the state arguments of complete denial of Bedouin land rights is composed of numerous legal and geographical determination. Each and every one incrementally contributes to the fixation of displaceability as a permanent situation. This relates, of course, to the nature of Bedouin tribal law, as we've just heard, legal history of discontinuity, actually, from Ottoman and Mandate periods, etc. So by applying a legal geographical perspective, which analyzes the interface of legal constructions with historical geographical developments, the research I conduct relies on the conceptualization by Iftahel and Tzfadia of gray spacing. This is a process which places Bedouin localities under a permanent in-between status, destruction and displacement on the one hand, and legalization and recognition on the other hand, because we do see incremental also recognition following Bedouin struggle for recognition. So the state has to give some, let's say, and not only, it completely denies land rights, but it does provide some services, et cetera, and a gradual recognition. So I would like to share with you a few legal constructs, which I analyze as contributing to this gray spacing of Bedouin space, but also, and this is my point to the graying of international protection itself, where Bedouins are only partly and temporarily protected, even under what is hoped to be an international protection, a better international protection. So in a cross-border analysis of displacement of Bedouins in the West Bank, which is part of my larger PhD project, I also combined the graying effect with a unifying effect. And I call this a grainifying process of international protection. I'm not going to speak today about the connection with West Bank Bedouins, but only relate to the graying effect. So the graying effect results from structural gaps in international law, but also spatial biases, which also Dr. Thabet just alluded to when he talked about urbanization. And this is my point. I'm going to reach it in a minute. So the fragmentation of international, just to say that international regulating forcible displacement differentiates between peace times and conflicts and indigenous people, we have different frameworks, and they do not always sit together and in a way that ties up all the gaps. And as Koskaniemi has said, fragmentation has well demonstrated the emergence and operation of structural biases. And in this, I would refer to indigenous vulnerability, which is kind of like falling in between the cracks. And the second one is, as I said, particular geographical assumptions, because international is usually being perceived as conceptual, theoretical, has no place. But when we place international law, we actually see that it does not always necessarily fit what Bedouins are actually experiencing. So I just want to touch on quickly on a few examples. The first one is the distinction between development and conflict-based displacement and its interplay with international indigenous displacement. So despite the historical legal attempt to universalize protections in all contexts, international soft law mechanism failed to incorporate indigenous protection, particularly in what becomes the primary sphere of development-based displacement, the city. The guideline principle, for example, for security of tenure for the urban poor from 2013, where you would think would highlight the situation of indigenous people, actually ignore them and they only refer to them once. So in the Negev, the urbanization of the metropolitan area of Beersheba has been one of the main triggers of Bedouin displaceability. Relocation to urbanized township, for example, in the case of al-Hiran, but the townships have been one of the major problems in Bedouin displaceability. And of course, in the al-Hiran case, Hura was presented also by the court as a solution for not throwing the Bedouins just to the streets. Although, of course, this is exactly what was done after the coerced negotiations for resettlement. The second point is fragmentation between development and conflict-based displacement, which fails to take into account the multifaceted national indigenous identity of Bedouin, as recalled by Mansour Nassasra and Dr. Murad and Dr. Thabet here and Suhad Bshara and others. So this requires a broader analytical perspective, incorporating the invisibility of Palestinian national identity of Bedouins, as exactly recently approved by the Israeli High Court of Justice in its ruling on the basic law, Israel nation state of the Jewish people, in Article 7, supporting the Jewish advancement and promotion of Jewish settlements in particular. The third point is textual discourse analysis shows that displacement commonly involves reference to actual movement, despite the fact that formally the prohibition extends to threats. So what I refer to as jurisdictional exclusion from plans, municipal areas, green zoning, which do not involve actual removals. This is exactly situation faced by Bedouins. So what you can think of as the absent present category of displacement evades the framework of protection, international protection. So sometimes, like in the case of al-Hiran, when the court comes to discuss this jurisdictional exclusion, it may rule, as it did, that it's actually too late in the game. So there were many layers of plans, approving the displacement of al-Hiran. And the last point is recalling the shift from preventative to regulatory approach in international protection. And therefore, negotiations become the key remedy for development-based displacement. And the practice of the state-led negotiation, state-controlled negotiations, not even allowing lawyers to be part of it. This is something I found out. So in the Negev, this is a clear example of the inherent failure of what UNRIP proposes as a solution, which is the principle of the free, prior, and informed consent in any negotiations with the state. So this is a problem that we don't see resolved. So to summarize, the domestic legal complexities doesn't exist in a void. international protection sustains, unfortunately, a graying process whereby settler interests are constantly sustained through a balancing process with liberal standards. And this process is referred to by Nicholas Blomley as self-policing, or by John McLaren as providing indigenous peoples with the tools to resist some of the more excessive demands of settlers for land and labor. And Bedouin displaceability is thus continues to be tainted with periodic darkening periods when immediate and clear settler motivations override, just as the case of Hiran indicates.
Thank you, Netta. I wish we had more time to discuss some of these points. I'm hoping we'll come back to at least a few of them. That was great. Yeela, shifting to the political dimension, the Bedouin can be seen as a classic case of indigenous people struggling against the modern state. But how does their struggle fit into the broader Israeli-Palestinian struggle?
Hi, can I put some pictures on? I've got a few, may I?
Sure.
Okay, let's see if it works. Hold on. Sorry, just a sec. I closed the pictures, I'm so sorry. The reason I want to show you a few photos is so that I can humanize the people that we're talking about and not just leave them as part of a discussion. First of all, I will just show you a village, a Bedouin village, just a minute. This village is this is part of a village called Aser. And in the background, we can see Be'er Sheva. And you can see that the people live in tin shacks and in very poor conditions. And the reason that they live in such poor conditions, half the Bedouin live in townships, half the Bedouin live in the villages, and the houses of the villages are in poor condition. And the reason that the houses of the villages are in poor condition connects to what was been said beforehand, is the fact that because these villages are not recognized, people do not have the ability to get a building permit. And I'm going to show you one more picture. And when you can't get a building permit, then your tin shack can be demolished. These demolitions are the worst part of the policies of all the things that Netta was talking of beforehand. One more picture. And when I say they're bad, we can see from this picture how much pain is involved when somebody gets their home destroyed. So this woman is talking to a police officer or to a police person. There were a whole bunch of police people during that time. Just a minute, one more picture. And the police, I had them here. Here they are. Here's my police. Yeah. And so the police come to the village. You can see the house here on the right. It's made out of tin. And as long as the policies are policies of non-recognition, then these houses are built very, very poorly because there is a chance that they will be demolished. So now I'll answer your question. Sorry, Eli. The Bedouins of the Negev are part of the Arab-Palestinian minority in Israel. It depends who you ask within the Arab Bedouin of the Negev. Are you Palestinian or are you not? They will have different answers. You can ask Morad later, although I can assume that Morad will say, I'm a Palestinian. Some will not. Some will say, I am a Bedouin. And the thing is that there are different histories, if we go further back, not since 1948, that create a different self-identity. Everybody's Muslim, everybody's Arab. How do you self-identify yourself? Now that is already your own personal question. Israel as a state has tried to make this divide and rule, and so it's happy when Arabs in the Negev will not self-identify as Palestinian, but it's a self-identification. What makes them different, the Bedouins of the Negev, from the rest of the Palestinian minority who are citizens of Israel? Everybody's a citizen of Israel. I'm talking about only the Palestinian minority who is a citizen of Israel, is that their land ownership, we're going back to land, was oral. And as such, when Israel became a state and tried to take up as much of the Arab Palestinian land, it was a lot easier for the state, this modern state, to tell the Bedouins you don't have land because you did not register your land in any of those modern entities or the modern registration entities that came before us. And in this sense, the Bedouin are an indigenous minority because when they, as Netta said, they turned to the United Nations to be recognized as an indigenous minority, not just a minority. One of the important points was that you have a different oral system of land ownership. And so that is a huge difference between the Bedouins and the rest of the Palestinian minority in Israel. And because of this difference, they are hurt a lot more. While the villages in the north, Israel took a while to recognize all the Palestinian villages in the north, it still is not recognizing most of the Bedouin villages in the south. And so in a process of, Thabet talked about the fact that initially everybody was pushed into the Siag, and then later Israel started urbanizing. Those who were urbanized, those who entered those 7 urban towns and 1 city, were those that were pushed in. So they didn't have their own traditional lands. And they're sitting now, 90% of the urban Bedouin are those who were pushed into the Siag and were pushed off their lands. Those who were sitting there beforehand did not join this urban process, and they refused. They said, this is where I came from. This is where my father lived. This is where my grandparents lived, and I will stay here. And so these stayed as villages. I saw there was already a question from the audience. So is there no success? Of course there is success, but it is slow. It is difficult. So for example, this is your next question, right? In 1997, when the Bedouins created a grassroots leadership organization called the RCUV, the Regional Council for the Unrecognized Villages, in protest of the way that Israel has been dealing with them. Israel dealt through the sheikhs. You'll be good, we'll give you some pasture rights, okay? Things like, well, you'll be good, we might give you a school. If you'll be good, we might give you water. That's very nice. So the Bedouin minority, the leadership of the Bedouin minority in the unrecognized villages said, that's enough. We now want to be, we want to fight for our rights in the civil way. So since 1997, for the first, I think, 7 years of this struggle, 11 villages were recognized. Now, that is not the end of the story. They are still, the government is still working, is postponing accepting the plans of the village that will fit with the need and the history of the villagers. I'll give it in 2 seconds. What does that mean? So we have this village, it's called Batin, a village of a few thousand people. The government looks at its maps, it sees nothing. But in fact, on the land, you have people who have land that they received, land that is, its ownership was oral, okay, still is oral. So people have these little pieces of land that they received from their father. The father divided it up among his 4 sons, and everybody has his own piece of land, not large, you're about a dunam, you need to translate that to American, what is it, 1/4 of an acre? And the government doesn't see anything. And so the government says, okay, there's nothing here. Let's make streets, let's make plots. You get this, you get that, you get that. And then the Bedouins say, no, we will not accept that. We have our land. I will not sit in another person's land. And Mourad, you talked about the violence. Israel has done this in your town, Mourad. They sold a piece of land that was belonging to someone else, to another person who did not know about it. And then the people moved this land that they were not aware that belonged traditionally to somebody else. And that caused extreme violence. People were actually killed. And so the plan between what the government wants, this empty land that will divide up nicely, and what actually exists there, people live there, there's 4,000 people living there according to the traditional holdings that go back hundreds of years. The government is refusing to reconcile, and the people are refusing to reconcile. We're not going to move like little pawns because this is what's right for you. And they adhere to the Bedouin law while the government of Israel refuses to even say it exists. That is more or less true unless you're willing to give up your land claim, and then I'll pay you for it.
And that's the only way the state recognizes the Bedouin land, when you sell it to the state.
When you forego your land claim, then you get money for foregoing your land claim. Mm-hmm. The Bedouins see it as the government buying their land, whereas the government views it in a very different way.
Thank you, Yeela. That was excellent. And you anticipated in the beginning of round two by beginning to address the question that I was going to ask about grassroots organizations like the RCUV that aid the Bedouin and give voice to the Bedouin in their struggle against the state. Staying with this theme of resistance, I want to mention the concept of Samud and discuss key cases where, if time allows, where Bedouin Samud is on display. And Yeela mentioned the RCUV. I want to quote something from the head of the RCUV, Atiya Al-Assam, who said of Bedouin resistance, and I quote, "Our struggle, symbolized by Arakib, is one of existence. We have no choice but to hang on to our Samud. We cannot accept the state's generous offer to abandon our lands for an urban land plot in one of the towns. This will destroy our communities and rob us of our homelands. Nor can we accept the miserable living conditions our communities have been condemned to. We strongly reject both options and demand a third path: remain on the lands inherited by our forefathers and receive all rights, services, and protection awarded to full citizens. Samud, a third path." Here, the Bedouin struggle aligns with what the Palestinian writer Raja Shehadeh describes as a third way between mute submission and blind rage. Samud, which means steadfastness in Arabic, is a noble, nonviolent ethic that links identity and political struggle to remaining on ancestral lands. For Shehadeh, Samud animates the will to remain on Palestinian land in the West Bank in what will be a Palestinian state. But Bedouin land in the Negev is not the same in this sense. And so Samud, Bedouin Samud, is different and can express itself in different ways. In the Bedouin village of Rahma, where the adjacent Jewish town of Yeruham has always shown the Bedouin good neighborliness, their Samud has led to cooperation, trust building, neighborly solidarity, which has in turn led to improved living conditions, a new school, and even a path to recognition. Regrettably, this has not been the model for Bedouin Jewish relations in the Negev. And so Arakib has become the symbol of Bedouin Samud. Netta, Arakib, an unrecognized Bedouin village that has been demolished by the state over 100 times, sits on land claimed by the Al-Ukbi family, whose ownership dates back to Ottoman times. The Supreme Court, after a trial that lasted several years, ruled against the family and declared Arakib state land. I want to kind of bring two questions together here because of time constraints, but why is this case perceived by some observers as the final word on Bedouin land claims? And why is there increasing attention to cases like Al-Qiran?
Okay, I think the Al-Ukbi case indeed has ended, and its judgment has been very comprehensive because the arguments that were presented wanted to challenge the legal paradigm that was dominant and is still, unfortunately, still dominant in Israeli jurisprudence. So the judgment is a new, I mean, it's an old construction in terms of Israeli legal perspective, but it actually takes each and every argument by the Bedouins that was presented in terms of any rights in the land from any angle, either domestic law or international law, and it rules against it. So it ruled that El-Araqib didn't exist as a village in Western eyes. Yeah, it didn't accept the proposed perspective by the Bedouins to see it in their own indigenous, according to their own indigenous criteria, lifestyle, etc., and self-determination. It did determine that it was the relevant date for such determination is 1858 and not any other date. So it was a very long historical geographical journey that ended up with facts not being completely canceled, but just ignored, basically facts that were presented to the court. So Bedouin, the whole paradigm of Bedouin land is dead land, and as Mawat is dead land, was just reaffirmed by the court, and the proposed a new paradigm, seeing it as a colonial-like terra nullius, a legal concept, and therefore should be abandoned, was not accepted in any way. So it was both factual and legal, and also a legal continuity. Just as Dr. Thabet was saying before, I mean, the argument by the Bedouin, I think, was presented very well by the experts, both Oren Iftahel and Sandy Kedar, that it was not legal historical continuity, but discontinuity that Israel has applied. So it relied on new constructions of what was the legal situation back then. So, but I just wanted to say that even though it doesn't influence, of course, future legal cases being brought on these arguments, there are still ongoing legal proceedings that still challenge the original, for example, land confiscation. So these are ongoing proceedings that we're not very hopeful that would be successful, but still, I think we have to see the fact that there are still legal proceedings relating somehow to land issues as a continuous struggle. I mean, the Bedouins, just as any other citizen would do, still continue to challenge the Israeli court system. But it's also important to notice that the Israeli legal system kind of occupies itself with the demolition orders and the eviction orders. So there are more cases being brought just as resisting the orders that are being issued all the time. And the fact that Al-Aqib has been demolished for around 200 times, it proves that the counterpower of indigenous resistance is still there, and is still part of the Sumud. So I wanted to add one more thing. I wanted to say that the fact that land is the fact that the Al-Uqbi case has disrupted the indigenous land connection paradoxically highlights two contradicting processes. So the first one is state position its actions for Bedouins as ex gratia, okay? So as a favor, because you have no rights, then we would, we're still facing the fact that Bedouins do have some basic needs, and we should find a solution for that. So it all being presented as an act of grace. So on the one hand, attention shifts to state policies of sustainability in new locations, or the financial support being given to recognized localities, approving connection to water, electricity, and temporary service centers, clinics, etc. And they're all, of course, under the title of voluntary state actions. And then the ex gratia paradigm exempts the state of its legal obligations towards the Bedouins as part of, either national homeland minority or a indigenous group with special connection to the land, territories, and resources. It introduces an act of grace rather than state obligation. The state further improves its position in negotiation with the Bedouins, of course, because they don't have any rights. They just have, they have to fight for a favor from the state, thus reinforcing the inherent imbalance between the settler state and indigenous people, which UNDRIP attempts to some extent is, as I said, it's not very helpful. More importantly, the ex gratia position enables the state to impose a non-indigenous discourse and contains any rights claimed under the cloak of colorblind individual rights. And this is, of course, not what the Bedouins want and not what the Bedouins would ask for. On the other hand, the ex gratia position is unable to completely resolve the Bedouin problem, as settler neoliberal interests deter the state from lightening, unlike, contrary to the darkening side, to lighten the situation and legalize all recognized localities. And neither it is able to completely suppress indigenous resistance by force. So building on historical Palestinian measures, as you were saying, nonviolence resistance, the third way, and the Sumud, we see a continuous presence of Bedouin in unrecognized localities. And so the state self-policing task becomes more and more challenging for the state. And that the number of demolished structures is on the rise, and more violence is exercised toward the Bedouins, then state-authored violence becomes more visible, and hence the international critique becomes more vocal, just as what happened with al-Hiran after the assassination of Yaqub Abu Al-Kian, right after the negotiation process has failed that night. So I just want to add and say that al-Hiran case pushes the legal discussion further beyond property rights and forcible displacement, even further to new international legal frameworks and cross-border geopolitical territories. The population replacement of Arabs with Jews triggered the discourse over the applicability of the prohibition of apartheid as an international crime, international evaluation of Israel's international responsibility, involving institutional racial hierarchy and subjugation of Arabs to the Judaization, very blunt Judaization process and settler motivation in the northern eastern Negev. And the case of al-Hiran has also clarified that the relevance of both legal and geographical fragmentation to Bedouin displaceability, the parallel policies that have been adopted in the West Banks in cases such as Khan al-Ahmar and Susia and many, many others, challenge the fragmentation here. So this broader question, I think, opened the door for new conceptualizations, and we would see maybe more joint struggles, as we have seen with the case of al-Hiran and Susia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Netta. Because of time constraints, I'm going to make a quick change, and I want to follow up on something you mentioned about the ex gratia position, and let Thabet tell us about the government committees, like the Goldberg Committee, which resulted in the prior plan. But first, briefly, let Yeela wanted to say a few more words about kind of partnerships, organizations that help the Bedouin in their struggle. Please, Yeela.
Oh, okay. First of all, Netta is a great example. Friends of mine, Jewish friends of mine, turned to me and said, "Hey, we want to petition." The Jewish community wanted to petition so a small Bedouin community that is by them will not be uprooted. And they were looking for a lawyer. So I said, "Hey, I've got a friend, Netta, she'll probably do a good job." And the court these were Jewish, this was a small Jewish community living very far south that hired Netta's services and sent her to court to petition for this community to not be uprooted until a settlement that they agreed to would be established. So when the neighborly relations work, as you said beforehand in Rachameh and Yerucham, it works. So it is very important to be able to do that. I have been part of the Regional Council for the Unrecognized Bedouin Village. It is unusual to have a non-Bedouin, in this case, not even a Palestinian, as part of this grassroots organization. And my experience has been that if anybody who is of the majority wishes to participate inside a minorities organization, and I'm sure everybody's done it, knows this, then we must allow the minority to lead. And our job is to be supporters. We need to provide what we received as the majority, and we have as the majority. Like when a Jew speaks in Israel, it sounds different than when a Palestinian speaks in Israel. You can compare it to white and black, or Native Americans and white Americans. So we need to bring our skills, our privileges to the struggle, but never expect that we should lead it, because if we lead it and the house is demolished, then someone else's house is demolished. I mean, it's not ours. So it's they must lead their own struggle. And someone also wrote to that there's a lot of similarities between the way Israel is treating the Bedouins and the way that the Bedouins struggle is an indigenous struggle. I agree with it 100%. And I want to add, when you did come to Israel, some people came to Israel when Professor Oren Iftachel made a conference about indigenous struggles. And I asked everybody, what is the most important thing needed to succeed? And the answer that every single person I turned to was that you need a grassroots organization that is a recognized leadership organization, and it needs to be. And so that for us, the Jewish organizations like BIMCOM and the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and other organizations that work with the Bedouin community, with the Bedouin leadership, we all know this. And so we're always working in such a manner, allowing our work to strengthen their leadership and their ability to change the situation. So there is, we don't have a big group of people. This is why I know everybody. We're not many, and we should be more. But those who are partnering with the Bedouin communities are doing it in the right way, and they are there, and they must continue to be there. So as organizations and as people.
Thank you, Yeela. And Dr. Alsana, I know you got skipped on the second question. You'll get the first question from the audience, and we have limited time, but I want to make sure Thabet tells us a little bit about the Goldberg Committee and specifically the PRAR plan and what's the status of the plan now.
Well, Eli, there are a lot of good questions. I suggest to move quickly to the good questions, but I have to say in the macro level a few things. The state of Israel is ideologically motivated. The issue of land, it's about identity. It's not like the land in Arizona or New Mexico or Nevada. Okay, it's the Holy Land. Okay, so it's very important to mention that Jews in the Negev have different options of living, of settlements. Okay, they have 8 different options of settlements, while the Bedouins have to move to townships. And this is the big difference. There is no equal treatment of the Arabs and the Bedouin Arabs and the Jews in the Negev. Well, land in Israel, actually, it's the same policy everywhere. It's the same policy for the Druze who are serving the Israeli army. For the Bedouins, is the same policy in Area C and in the Negevs. Empty the land, okay, and to transfer it to the state of Israel. Well, the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who was the Negev resident, enhanced the discourse of the need for protecting the land from the Bedouin trespasser and the need for urbanizing the Bedouins. This is his own terminology. The policy of displacement didn't start with him, with Ariel Sharon. It has been the policy of all Israeli governments. It was enhanced under his own government. So this is why in December 2007, the committee of Goldberg was established. He is a former judge who heads the committee, and he actually his committee is supposed to give advice, policy advice in regulating the Bedouin settlements in the Negev. One year later, the report came from Goldberg committee that actually recommended to give the Bedouins 50% of the land they live on, and to negotiate the half of the land, the remaining half of the land that the Bedouins claim. And he recommended also recognizing as much as possible of the unrecognized villages. The government did adopt at that time the Goldberg report and nominated implementation committee, the Power committee. However, the Power plan, the Power committee did something different, okay? And it's became the most serious plan of uprooting and displacing the Bedouins. And the plan attempted to displace around 40,000 Bedouins from their homes and villages. The Power plan was meant to implement actually a recommendation of of Goldberg committee, but it comes with something new, okay? The two main components of Power plan are the decision to legislate a law to resolve ownership claims and compensation for these claims with restricted enforcement mechanism and a 5 years timeline. Also, the second main component, a restrictive planning arrangement for possible Bedouin settlements within a specific clearly demarcated region in the Negev. And the Power plan actually recommended to immediately transfer 50% of the land claimed to the state and demolish the majority of the unrecognized villages and concentrate the Bedouin in the 7 governmental planned towns and the so-called Abu Basma villages. The most dangerous thing, I believe, in the recommendation of Power plan, actually, to restrict Bedouin settlements to the northern Nakab and east of Route 40. For the first time in the history of Israel, they are restricted. I know, I grew up in Israel. There are restricted areas for military purposes, security purposes. For the first time, preventing from the Bedouins to live west of the main road, Route 40, mean in the western and northern part of the Negev. Well, the Power plan did pass in the first reading in the Knesset in a small margin, but the opposition to the plan, there was a strong opposition to the plan, and bill in the grassroots level, demonstration in weekly demonstrations and confrontation with the Israeli police, actually. And on the other hand, a lot of international advocacy actually did make the work, and the government did hold the plan and concentrated in planning and the quiet negotiation with the people, the Bedouin people. Today, the issue of forced displacement is almost not on the table. However, there is a quiet, I would say, displacement and a massive house destruction. Over 2,000 houses. Actually, it's each year the Israeli government is destroying over 2,000 houses. It's something that unacceptable. What the Bedouins are demanding today, actually, treat us the way you are treating the Jewish residents of the Negev. Give us different options of living. We would like to just continue preserve our way of living. The the way the Jews can live in a kibbutz, in a moshab, in small communities, I believe that the Bedouins are entitled to the same rights.
Thank you so much, Thabet. Time is running out rapidly. With just the last minute or so, I want to give Murad, and I want to at least ask one question from the audience. We have an excellent question from Priscilla Reed. This is for Dr. Elsana. Do the reports by B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch affirming that Israeli treatment of the Palestinians constitutes apartheid, is that applicable to the situation of the Bedouin in the Negev? Murad?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, it is applicable. The situation of the Bedouin in the Negev present the state's apartheid or discrimination in very obvious way, and not only in the way that how it treats the Bedouins and discriminate against them, but also there are separate systems within the government that are designated for the Bedouin themselves. For example, until recently, you have the Bedouin Educational Administration, which was never or did not exist in any other place in the state. And today, until today, we have the Bedouin Land Administration, which is Aminhelet Likudum Bedouin, the administration for the development of the Bedouin. Also, it deals with the Bedouin land and settlement issues, and there is no other equivalent governmental system like this in Israel. So these are only two examples, but the other examples are a lot for the Bedouin themselves. So if you go to get services in Beersheba city, you will see yourself treated in a very distinct and different place rather than the Jewish or the other Arab population in the state of Israel. So this is applies to the Bedouin, but I want to say another comments in regarding to the concept of sumud that you just talked about. And I would like to say here that the concept of sumud for the Bedouins is not coming from the international law or from the Israeli law. It comes from the Bedouin law itself, the Bedouin culture that related and connected to the Palestinian identity. The difference between the Bedouins and the other Palestinian identity is only cultural, and the Bedouin identity is only sub-identity within the Arab-Palestinian identity in Israel. So it's not separate from the Palestinian. It's part of it. It's sub-identity. We call it a cultural identity. So they speak the same language. They live in the same area. They share the same history and many other things, but they maybe speak a little bit differently, eat different food, or sing in a different place. That's the cultural thing that's separate. And the last point I want to mention here is related to the international law, and especially to the international human rights law in Israel. What I want to say that unlike many people who thinks international human rights law does not apply to the Bedouins. Okay, I have written the whole chapter in my book about this topic and showed that all the protections that the international law tried to offer for minorities and indigenous people around the world, they does not apply to the Bedouins, because Israel were able to limit and block these human rights techniques or protections to the Palestinian in general and to the Bedouins as part of the Palestinian in Israel.
Thank you, Murad. And thank you to all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion about this important topic. With time now running out, I turn things back over to Dr. Dwork for closing remarks.
I add my thanks to Eli's, and I thank you, Eli, for chairing. Many thanks to everyone, speakers and listeners, for joining today. This panel garnered advance interest, and I thank the authors of those articles for bringing our event to the attention of people who otherwise would not have known about it. This panel prompts all of us to think anew and to continue the conversation on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.